Do you get this feeling that video games of old are better than video games of today? Instead of discussing whether or not older games are better than newer games, a more productive discussion is to ask the reason why you consider older games to be better. Because of course older games are better than the newer ones. The question is why? Is it because the gameplay of older games are varied or less linear? You need to be a little bit more specific, which is why I'm going to visit a random channel that I noticed that talk about this topic. But before we get into the older games versus newer game stuff, the video description stated that this is a follow-up to his previous video. So let's check out the previous video. The title of this video is How AAA Market is Ruining Video Games. In my opinion, the title should be How AAA Market is Ruining Video Games in 2017, because the games that he used to illustrate this point are AAA games in 2017 alone. The video is talking about how For Honor and Mass Effect Andromeda are two garbage AAA titles that go way beyond disappointment, and then you have the controversies of loot boxes, microtransactions, and just all-around greed regarding Destiny 2, Star Wars Battlefront 2, and Middle-earth Shadow of War. The release of these AAA games have completely disappointed our YouTuber Darwood Frost. His wish is that AAA games change from the state of us looking down at them in disappointment into back in the days where we used to look up to them for great games.
It's my hope that next year the great games of the year won't get drowned out by negative stories, most all surfacing from the companies we should be looking up to rather than down on.
A good point that he made is that the controversies of all of these AAA games have overshadowed a lot of great AAA games like Horizon, Odyssey, and Breath of the Wild. I might also add Resident Evil 7 and Persona 5 on the list. Do I have any major criticism? Not really. Minor disagreements, but nothing too major. I think the video is very well put together, but in my opinion, there's nothing much of the video that we don't already know. And by we, I mean those who have paid attention to what happened with games, either by reading the news or just watching my videos or other people's videos for it. If you want to catch up with some of the loot box videos that I did, I'll link to them in the description. Now let's move on to his other video about older games being better. Oh, actually, before we move on, I want to give huge thanks to C, Little Big Quebec, Leon, Carl, and Daniela for the pledges on Patreon. You guys are fantastic.
Where is the love and passion for video games when it was so easy to find 20 years ago?
I think it's because you have covered up at least 20 years of games. In that span of year, we have produced tons and tons of passionate masterpieces, more so than the past 5 years, if I'm being generous of what I would consider new.
New role-playing games like Final Fantasy XV, Fallout 4, and even The Witcher 3 pretty much play themselves, allowing players to go on autopilot as they stare into the deep abyss of that mini-map compass.
That's not necessarily bad in my honest opinion. Doom 2016 handhold me, and it's one of my favorite games of that year. Sometimes handholding can get ridiculously infantilizing, sure, but they're just white noises at this moment, frankly.
Take a look at their old counterparts. It's a very different experience playing something like Chrono Cross. There's no blinking arrow to follow. You've got to explore, ask questions, and figure out where to go the old-fashioned way.
Well, you are somewhat correct. I just think Witcher 3 and Chrono Cross are good examples to highlight your point. If you want a much better example of handholding, it would be Hitman Blood Money and Hitman 2016. Both games offer total freedom and exploration in how you execute your targets. The difference is Hitman 2016 just straight up tells you how to kill your targets, while in Blood Money, you have to experiment. Thankfully, in the newer one, you can just turn that off and do it the old-fashioned way while abusing the quick save button, as in play in the harder difficulty. My argument for this point is that handholding is not universally bad as long as it doesn't hamper the player's own freedom, and nowhere this is more apparent than the next example.
Fallout 2's freedom, discovery, and player-driven narrative versus Fallout 4's all-seeing compass is another example.
Yeah, that's a horrendous example. I've played both Fallout 2 and Fallout 4, and both games offer freedom, discovery, and player-driven narrative. You can argue that Fallout 4 does it worse than Fallout 2, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't do that. It's like comparing a well-made fresh sandwich to a mediocre sandwich. They're both sandwiches, it's just that one tastes worse than the other. The point here is, just because games have hand-holding elements doesn't necessarily mean they hamper the player's freedom. They make it easier and therefore less satisfying to accomplish, but as long as the game is not linear, I don't really mind being hand-holded. Say what you want about Fallout 4 and how mediocre it was, it still offers freedom, discovery, and player-driven narrative. It's just that it does it worse than the previous games, and that's an entirely different thing than not doing it at all.
One of the big modern trends is to create the stop and start game, where control is taken from you without your ability to do anything about it. Games that let you play for a minute, but then stop the gameplay to explain something, or to point something out, or to provide exposition. Shooting games like Battlefield or Call of Duty let you play for 45 seconds before stopping you for a cutscene, a forced interaction, a "hey, look at this," or to kick a door in. Why do we have to kick in so many doors?
Yeah, I think it's very much universally agreed at this point that Call of Duty campaigns have never been good since Modern Warfare 1, or if you're incredibly generous, Blops. Battlefield campaigns have also never been good as well, so I'm going to skip this point.
Watching a long cutscene in a Naughty Dog game is different because the rest of the game is outstanding and non-contrived. Most exposition is actually interactable as well, which is a neat way of releasing control back to the player while things are actually happening. But when Battlefront 2 won't stop sending me down linear corridors, interrupting my gameplay, or making me holster my weapon, it's just not the same.
I can explain why. Battlefront 2's story was meh, while Uncharted 4's story was excellent. To all AAA game developers out there, if you want to be movies, at least be a good one. Far Cry, the story in 3 was great, at least the first half was, but 4 is only good if you let me join Pagan Min. No? Then let me skip it, please. I have no issues with games removing control from the player for a brief moment just for the story to be told. Spec Ops The Line did this, Resident Evil 7 did this, Crysis 2 did this, even Doom 2016 did this without the ability to skip the cutscenes. I love these games despite the controls being taken away from the players briefly because either the gameplay compensates very well for it like Resident Evil 7, Crysis 2, and Doom 2016, or the story is pretty damn interesting and well put together like Spec Ops and Uncharted. So again, this new feature is not necessarily bad, it's just that it doesn't need to be overblown, and you need to do something else that justifies it, which Battlefront 2 did not do and instead just give us a lame and generic third-person shooter with a very meh story.
Back in the day, the video game experience was much more about challenging gameplay. I think a great example are the classic platformers like Mario, Banjo, Donkey Kong, and Spyro the Dragon. This dying breed of games had the features any serious gamer craves. Innovative gameplay, unique mechanics, and a great story. Plus, they were just fun games that celebrated being fun. They let you dive into the action. No minimap, no manipulative game design, and no hand-holding. You had to figure out how to complete the game by yourself, or how to unlock warps, or throw yourself through giant paintings.
I agree, but I guess the real problem is that modern AAA games are stagnating and not innovating at all. It's not about the hand-holding. Modern Warfare 1 has a fully scripted campaign that was very well put together despite the regenerating health and the two-weapon system. When you do the same thing more and more in every installment of the game, it becomes tedious, exhausting, and boring. The issue here is not how modern games handhold the player or have regenerating health or any other dumbed down modern game mechanics out there, but how modern games just refuse to innovate and play it safe, which to your credit, you actually went on in detail in the last part, so at least you understand the real issue here. But my point still stands. Modern gameplay mechanics that prioritize convenience, easiness, and hand-holding don't necessarily mean a bad game. A sandwich being baked in a pan doesn't necessarily mean that it's tastier than a sandwich with a bread baked in a toaster. Unless you're cooking in a gas-leak kitchen.
This is the critical piece to the failing of the modern-day video game. We don't have to figure out anything anymore. We're given every possible helping hand imaginable, follow-me quest arrows, detailed minimaps, simplified objectives, and a compass that connects the dots for us. There's no thinking in video games today or piecing solutions together.
That is debatable. Older RPG games like Deus Ex, for example, they still give you objectives and journals that literally tell you what you have to do next. Even older Fallout games or Morrowind, if you open the journals, they literally tell you what to do next. The difference is that Deus Ex doesn't have the floating arrows telling you where the actual objectives are, which can still be figured out anyway if you just read the goals menu. Morrowind not only has a journal, but also a map just in case you're lost, and some quests in Skyrim don't even give you floating arrows. The one old RPG that I can recall that doesn't really tell you what to do next is Shin Megami Tensei 3, and honestly, figuring out where you're supposed to go to proceed the main quest in Shin Megami Tensei 3 is about as frustrating as, well, the entire freaking game.
The Witcher 3 is guilty of all of this, yet there are moments of brilliance when it pushes this hand-holding to the side. You'll come across the odd treasure hunting mission, or here's a map and a clue, figure it out quest from Yennefer, for example. I would argue that The Witcher 3 should have pursued more of these, as the rest of the game is a cakewalk that falls prey to being overly accessible. After all, you can spend the entire game staring at the minimap and those dots. Thankfully, you can turn off much of these options in the menu, but this is a rare feature.
No. That is just flat out wrong. Pretty much a lot of games that I've played in the past 3 years have the option to turn off the floating arrows. You really need to play more games.
The revolution to make our games easier and provide such assistance to the player at every opportunity has potentially made us less curious and adventurous. We have become less patient and explorative, relying on systems that make things easier rather than challenging.
Yeah, hand-holding elements do not always mean less challenged, nor do they make players less explorative.
Obtaining a new weapon in Assassin's Creed is about clicking your map and identifying treasure locations, rather than requiring you to find it by yourself, or a clue, or a map, or a book entry.
Okay, I haven't played Assassin's Creed Origins. If they revealed the treasure in the maps right at the start, that's pretty freaking dumb. That is a bad cause of hand-holding to the players, and it makes the treasure to be more like collectibles instead. But if you do need to find book entries and or clues, after you find all of them and figure out the location, wouldn't you, I don't know, mark it on your map? Hell, if you find a map for the treasure, wouldn't you mark the treasure on your own map? To be fair, Assassin's Creed 4 did this treasure hunting mechanics pretty well with its treasure maps. But then again, since the treasure map just tells you where the coordinates are, might as well have it marked on the map immediately.
What happened to the days of exploring, walking around, talking to people, or stumbling on something really cool, or playing a game for the sake of enjoyment rather than achievement?
What happened? Well, they still exist, they just got easier. You can still explore in Assassin's Creed Origins or Far Cry Primal or Fallout 4, it's just that the exploration is boring because they are made easier and more tedious. Again, there's a difference between things not existing and things being bad or easy. I think you're equating bad or easy exploration mechanics for being non-existent, two completely different things. While you can argue that the floating arrows do make it appear non-existent, that's like saying the street post in Disneyland hampers your freedom of going anywhere. Not really, they just show you direction, not hamper you out of your freedom. You can choose not to follow it. I'm gonna quote Yahtzee for this one actually.
With the evidence piling up that the industry leans more towards nose-leading, bottom-smacking sightseeing tours, it's very gratifying to finally play a game that's more organic than a brick in a dishwasher. Yes, there are still mysterious floating arrows the game expects you to stand under if you want to make progress, but if you don't feel like it, you can walk 78 miles in the opposite direction, put a cooking pot over a dog's head, and swat at his knackers with a woodsman's axe until he howls himself deaf.
The rest of the video talks about the stagnation of AAA gaming, which I fully agree, and again, if you've been paying attention with the state of AAA games, you will agree that they've been playing it safe, dumbing down all of the elements, and let's not forget the greed. I'm talking specifically to games made by Ubisoft, EA, or Activision. All three have been rocking bland and mediocre titles that were jack while trying so hard to milk the consumers as much as possible. Now, some people say that the title was clickbait. I personally don't think that way. I think it's him being genuine about his comments on why modern games suck or how AAA games ruin the industry. I think both of these videos have valid points, but the one thing that I find quite surprising as I'm writing this video is realizing the real intention of the creator. Based on this and his general disdain towards the AAA industry, I think there is a sense that Downward Thrust is attempting to save the AAA industry. So I think a good question that should be asked through this entire thing is, should AAA games or AAA game publishers be saved? Well, to answer that question, my best games of 2017 are a JRPG, a game made in Japan, a game made in Japan, an indie game, a mid-budget game, and another mid-budget game. None of these are from Ubisoft, EA, or Activision, so instead of trying to figure out how to save AAA, I would rather just let them die in a painful death so that a new AAA can emerge, and perhaps maybe in 2020, the new AAA will be about as greedy and horrendous as this one. Until then, I would say, let's not save AAA games. Let it rot and burn in a fire. Seriously, who doesn't want to see Ubisoft, EA, and Activision burn and rot to their demise after the amount of anti-consumer BS that they've done for the past 3 to 5 years? Absolutely let them burn. Or let them hoard themselves by sucking our dicks for once.